There's a parable by Jesus that I think sort of sets the stage for what I'm going to talk about this morning in this lesson. It's in Luke chapter 14, verses 7 through 11. But before we get there, let me explain the context. We learn in verse 1 of the chapter that Jesus has been invited by a Pharisee to a meal. What's fascinating to me is that Luke actually has Jesus eating meals at Pharisees' houses as well as the houses of the common folk. But anyway, it's the Sabbath, and he's been invited to a meal. Now, I'm sure to be invited by a Pharisee was an important thing. And while he's there, there's a man who has dropsy. And of course, Jesus does his usual thing: is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath, or unlawful? Nobody says anything, so he heals the man, and everybody's kind of, what do we do now? But then Jesus notices, it says, everybody vying for the best seats. Now, to us, for the most part, we don't think about the best seats, although when we go to various functions, there is a table where the guest speaker sits, and other luminaries, luminaries, and that would be somewhat of the equivalent. But anyway, Jesus tells this parable in noticing how people sit at the best seats, or vying for the best seats. He says that suppose somebody gave a wedding feast, and you're invited, and I'm sure that would be very important to be invited, by somebody in town who's of social standing, because that means they consider you to be of social standing. And so when you go there, for some reason or other, maybe you get there early, or maybe you're looking around and you think, hey, I'm the most important person here, so you go and seat yourself at the most important spot. But then someone more distinguished than you comes in, and the host says, please get up and give your seat. And then you're forced then to be humiliated in front of everybody by going to the last. Now, I have not read that much about whether or not, why can't the host put you in your proper seat and make everybody else. But even if he did that, you would still be humiliated, because you'd be moved out of what you thought was the best seat and where you deserved to be. So in order to avoid this, he said, you take the last seat and then let the host move you up, because everybody who exalts himself will be humbled, and everybody who humbles himself will be exalted. So Jesus is really saying, if you want to avoid being humiliated, then humble yourself. Now, I know it kind of seems to me that as I read through the Gospels that a lot of the Jewish leaders and a lot of the Jews that Jesus dealt with had been influenced by the Roman Empire. Birth, wealth, position, citizenship determined your social status. Now, for the Romans, you were a patrician. You were a patrician eligible for the Senate, which was the highest, or an equestrian, one small step down, or a plebeian, which was the lowest class and just above the slaves. There was really no middle class like we have. You're either way up there or way down there, or way, way down there. The Romans' class structure was also built on what was called patronage. It's a very intricate system of benefactors and their clients. Favors were the currency of the system, and the more favors that were owed to you as a benefactor, the higher you would rank in society. That ranking was also affected by the number of favors you as a client owed to others. And so tied up in this system of favors owed and collected was a strong sense of honor and shame. It would be extremely embarrassing to owe someone a favor and be unable to repay that when the benefactor requested it. Such an embarrassment would certainly lower your social standing. At the same time, there was a stigma attached to calling in a debt that you knew could not be repaid. Social standing was everyone's goal. And you were always trying to figure out how you could be one rung above everybody else around you. but it required making sure you were owed enough favors by others who were below you on the ladder, requiring constant maneuvering and a good memory for who owed what to whom. Someone said, I thought about the cafeteria and the locker room in the school bus. You remember what it's like there. We had, where you sat was really important. And so you see, status counts. And one of the key places where status is displayed is at mealtime. Guests of honor who were seated close to the host, while those who were of lesser importance sat further away. And those who weren't invited at all weren't considered important. So to be invited to a better position at the table of your host was not just an honor, it would mean tangible benefits to you and your businesses as well. But Jesus, in noticing this, says, well, why don't you take a step back, and rather than trying to promote yourself, rather than trying to raise yourself up and elevate yourself, why not humble yourself and let others take care of it? If you haven't figured out, we're talking a little bit about humility, and I'll kind of tie you into my sermon series here in just a minute. But let's define humility and look at it, as Paul and others wrote about it. The Greeks thought of humility as being of low social status, undistinguished. Now, I'm sure you've been at places where a professor was introduced. I would like to introduce you to the distinguished professor of. No one would say, I would like to introduce to you our special guest, the undistinguished professor of. No, a professor wants to make sure that he's got lots behind his name so that when he's introduced or she's introduced, that there's a lot to be said about them, that they deserve whatever honor it is that they're receiving. But it means to be of low social status, undistinguished, of no account. Now, I remember in the South when we said somebody is of no account, that was really a bad thing. They were really a bad individual. But just of no account means that there's nothing about you that sets you apart. You've done nothing. You've not accomplished anything big. Instead, you're just a face in the crowd. It also means being servile in manner, pliant and subservient. In the Roman Empire, nobody wanted to be that way. Everybody wanted to be above somebody. Everybody wanted to be in charge of something. And the same was in Palestine and the Jewish community as well. Nobody wanted to be servile. Nobody wanted to be under the thumb of someone. Everybody wanted to be thought of as important and of high standing. In the Greek, it also means being unpretentious. Now, pretentious means that you claim or behave as if you are important and deserving merit, when such is, whether it's the case or not, you claim and behave as if you are important, showing or betraying an attitude of superiority. You've met those. When I was in high school, our senior year, we did senior wills, where we bequeathed something. It was kind of a funny little thing that we did, and so as a senior, you're leaving, so it's like you're dying, so you leave something behind, and so it's a senior will. Well, there was a girl in, I think it was a class or two ahead of me, and she said, I bequeath a box of Kleenex to, and then she named the guy. She actually named her so that she wouldn't have to hold her nose so high. And man, what a cut she did back then. She really took that gal down. But she felt that the gal she was talking about was very arrogant and had an air of superiority, was thus pretentious, marked by an extravagant or presumptuous outward show, ostentatious, showy. And so a humble person in Greek is somebody who is not pretentious. who doesn't claim to be superior in any way, shape, or form. Now, in the English, it means the state or character of being humble, freedom from pride and arrogance, lowliness of mind, and sometimes a low estimate of oneself, self-abasement. And sometimes that's the way we look at being humble and humility from a downside. Now, there's a connotation and a denotation for every word. Denotation is how we define it. Like the word mob, means a group of people in essence, but we usually use mob, and this is our connotation in a negative sense. Oh, I was at Walmart and what a mob of people were there. And by that, we're saying negative things about the group of people that were there. They were acting pushy, and you know what that brings up. And so you see, humility, humbleness, kind of brings out that negative side to a lot of people. A politician was reviling a political opponent, at a press conference. A reporter interrupted him and said, "But surely you must admit that he, your opponent, is a humble, modest man." And then the first politician smiled and replied, "Yes, he is a humble man, but he has much to be humble about." C.S. Lewis, though, I thought had a very good definition. Humility is not thinking less of yourself, but thinking of yourself less. Thomas Merton said, "Pride makes us artificial and humility makes us real." Humility is the opposite of arrogant. It's the opposite of thinking of yourself in a superior way. You remember the song by Carly Simon, "You're So Vain." She was one of my favorite singers of back when I was in high school. But anyway, "You're So Vain." Carly never revealed about it, although I think here recently she did, and I forgot to look it up. But for a long time, she didn't reveal who she was talking about. However, everybody thought that she was talking about Warren Beatty. Warren Beatty was a very, very good actor. At least some thought he was, and apparently had a rather high opinion of himself. But anyway, the two of them had dated, and Beatty had dumped her. And then after she did the song, he called her up and thanked her for writing about him. That was the rumor. And of course, the words say, "You're so vain, you probably think this song is about you." So you see, humility really is thinking, humility is really being modest and about ourselves, and not arrogant and not superior. It was not a virtue that the Greeks and the Romans liked and wanted to develop. The Romans especially, they were a very proud people, and they wanted honor and to be distinguished. And in order to do that, you had to step on a few people along the way. But being humble means that you didn't step on people. Let me remind you of what I'm doing. Ephesians chapter 4, verses 1 through 3. "Therefore I, the prisoner of the Lord, implore you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling with which you have been called, with all humility and gentleness, with patience, showing tolerance for one another in love, being diligent to preserve the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace." So I'm talking about walking in a manner worthy of our calling. What Paul does is I'm going to show that Paul has 5 qualities here. And the first one is humility. And that's what it means to walk in a manner worthy of our calling. And I'll kind of connect that into our calling here as I close out. But when we think about humility, first of all, is not self-abasement. Back up earlier in our English translation, there is part of the definition, a low estimate of oneself, self-abasement. But that's not really what humility is, either, I think, in the Greek or in the way that it's used in Scripture. And we'll get into a little bit more what its focus is, but it's not putting yourself down. And we kind of tend to think that that's really what humility or humbleness is all about. Is, I can't do that. Or I'm not, I'm just not the kind of person who, who is able to do those sorts of things when in fact we can, or maybe we think we can. So it's not putting yourself down. After a tough and discouraging day at work, Melvin plopped himself on the couch and began wallowing in self-pity. He moaned to his wife, "Nobody cares about me. In fact," he replied, "the whole world hates me." Without even looking up from her work, Melvin's wife replied, "That's not true, honey. The whole world couldn't possibly hate you because most of them don't know you." And yet we wallow in self-pity and we put ourselves down because we think everybody hates us. We think that nobody thinks we can do it. And so we take on that same evaluation of ourselves, self-abasement. But that's not what humility is all about. But humility is, though, I think, a proper evaluation of self. And Paul gives us that perfect definition in Romans chapter 12 and verse 3. Romans 12 and verse 3. "For through the grace given to me, I say to everyone among you not to think more highly of himself than he ought to think, but to think so as to have sober judgment, as God has allotted to each a measure of faith." Because Paul is there trying to talk about where we fit into the body and to find the various skills that we have so that we can minister to folks within the body of Christ. And Paul says the best thing to do is to think of yourself in a sober manner. And so humility is really about thinking myself in relationship to God. Yes, I'm a sinner. Yes, I am less than what he created me to be. But God, in his great mercy, has given me an opportunity to be his child once again, to be his citizen, to be his servant. And so I'm not here at doing my own thing. I'm here doing his. And so I need to think of myself properly in relationship to him. Also in relationship to my own skills and personality. God has blessed us with the skills and the talents, the attitudes and so forth that we've developed over our lifetime. They're not really something that we ourselves have given us. They're what God has given us. And I think we ought to use them and not to keep them hidden. And of course, it's also important to evaluate ourselves properly in relation to others. There are others who sometimes are better than we are. I know that there are lots of preachers out there who are very gifted in their speaking, and I don't have any illusions about being better than any of them. I know that there are some probably not as good as I am, but even if we do think about that, that shouldn't be a source of pride and arrogance. Instead, it should be just a proper evaluation. There are some better, there are some worse, and so do the best that I can. But it means to think about yourself properly. There was a physicist named Henry Rowland. He lived from 1848 to 1901. He was a professor of physics at Johns Hopkins University, and apparently he was once called as an expert witness at a trial. During cross-examination, the lawyer for the defense, I think, said, "What are your qualifications as an expert witness in this case?" And apparently Rowland was normally modest and very retiring about himself and his skills, but he replied quite frankly, "I am the greatest living expert on the subject under discussion." Later, a friend who was well acquainted with Rowland expressed surprise at the professor's uncharacteristic answer. And Rowland answered by shrugging his shoulders and said, "Well, what do you expect me to do? I was under oath." But humility is properly evaluating who we are and what we can do in our relationship to others. Humility is also not selfish ambition, because I think that creates unnecessary competition between us and others. And in the church, that is not good. Paul wrote in Philippians chapter 2 and verse 3, "Do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit, but with humility of mind, regard one another as more important than yourselves." Competition hurts relationships. And sometimes, we do it without really thinking about it, especially if we're a little bit more knowledgeable than somebody else. We might correct them, or we might do whatever. Or we might like to beat them at a certain game or whatever. We just like to show off. But in the church, that's not good. I read this week somebody talking about humility in the secular world. And And he said, experts in management tell us that most people wear an invisible sign that reads, please make me feel important. If we heed that sign, we can succeed in human relations. On the other hand, if we say or do things that make others feel insignificant, we will fail. Then people will respond by becoming angry and resentful, and nobody wants to be noticed and made, because everybody wants to be noticed and made to feel important. You remember King Rehoboam, 1 Kings chapter 12. He was the son of Solomon. Solomon died. King Rehoboam had the 10 northern tribes come to him through this fellow named Jeroboam, and they said, listen, your father created a heavy burden on us. Lighten our load, please. Solomon had conscripted people to build the temple and so forth, and so now that he was gone, they came and said, okay, everything's built, lighten our load. Now, Rehoboam went to the men who advised Solomon, and they say, listen, if you give in to their demands, if you lighten their load, they will be your servants for life. But the young men said, nah, let them know, boy, I'm going to hammer you down. And so he came back and told them, no. If you think my father burdened you, wait till you see what I do to you. But then, of course, Israel became angry. They divided, and Rehoboam split the kingdom. So you see, humility requires that we don't be selfish in our ambition or in our competition. But humility also requires us to evaluate others as well. Again, getting back to our text in Philippians chapter 2, verse 3, do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit, but with humility of mind, regard one another as more important than yourselves. Regard others as more important as yourselves. It may not always be easy to do, especially if you think of yourself as a pretty important person. And yet, that's what Paul requires. Even if they're not more important than you, even if they're not better than you, even if they're not smarter than you, still consider them better. Because that way you elevate them. And when you elevate them, they become your friend. And especially true within the church. Supposedly, and I tried to, in fact, all of the stories that you've heard so far, I tried to authenticate, but wasn't able to do. Still, I like the stories that as I found them. But anyway, and the stories were about real people. I could authenticate the people. But anyway, there was a musician in Britain, Sir Robert Mayer. From 1879 to 1985 he lived. And on his 100th birthday, which was in 1979, they were having a big reception for him in order to honor him. Well, there was an elderly British socialite named Lady Diana Cooper. And yes, she really existed. In fact, there's even a picture of Lady Diana Cooper and Robert Mayer together. But anyway, she fell into conversation with a very friendly woman who seemed to know her well. Lady Diana's, of course, her eyesight prevented her from recognizing her fellow guest until she peered a little bit more closely, and she realized she was talking to Queen Elizabeth. Overcome with embarrassment, Lady Diana curtsied and stammered, "Ma'am, oh ma'am, I'm sorry, I didn't recognize you without your crown." She wasn't wearing a crown. And Queen Elizabeth said, it was so much Sir Robert's evening that I decided to leave it behind. Wow, if that is indeed the case, what a humble individual Queen Elizabeth is. What a humble individual. I mean, what humility she displayed by not calling attention to herself, but letting him have his day. And you see, that's what humility is all about, is letting others have the limelight, letting others be elevated, thinking of themselves more importantly than us. You know, America needs humility. We really do. I mean, when you stop and think about what goes on in social media, what goes on with our politicians and so forth, we really need virtue. But yet, that's not what America is about. We want to be noticed. Think about the people on the reality shows, and think about American Idol. I've never watched American Idol very much, seen a bit here and there. And sometimes I wonder, do those people really think they sing well? They must have a high opinion of themselves. Either that, or else they're just trying to have fun. But we read books about successful people, and we watch shows. We watch shows. We don't watch shows entitled Dancing with Hermits, but instead Dancing with the Stars. We love success, status, and prestige. We want to know the right people. We want to be able to tell people that we met this person or that person. When I've not told very many people this, but see, I only met him once. But the actor who played the oldest son in the Brady Bunch, he actually went to Pepperdine University in Malibu when I was a sophomore there, and I actually did shake his hand, but he probably would never remember me. But being able to tell people that story, I feel a little important. No, I don't. But anyway, you see, we have a pecking order, and we seek to use it according to our advantage as best we can, just like the guests choosing the seats of honor at the Pharisees' banquet in Jesus' gospel lesson. But even Jesus' own disciples had to learn this. You remember that James and John came to Jesus and said, hey, we have a request. We want to sit on your right and your left hand. You see, they wanted the best seats. They were the sons of thunder. They were the ones who deserved that. They even got their mom to ask. And Jesus says, well, it's not mine to give. But they were concerned about who was the greatest. Don't be concerned about who is the greatest. Now, getting back to our text, Paul said we are to walk in a manner worthy of our calling with which we've been called. Our calling, I believe, is found in Ephesians chapter 3 and verse 10, where Paul says we're making known the manifold wisdom of God through the church is what we do. I believe that's our calling. And if we're to do that, then we really need humility, the first quality on Paul's list. We are out here to serve our God. We're out here to serve our Savior. We're out here to let others know about what God did for us through Jesus Christ. We're not out letting others know what we've done. Who cares what we accomplished? Who cares what things we know and what things we don't know? Who cares what trophies we have on our shelves? Who cares what we've accomplished in our jobs? Our function as Christians is to be called to make known the manifold wisdom of God. And we can't let the world see us in selfish competition and arrogance if we're to gain them. Instead, we have to have the proper attitude, the attitude of Jesus, who was humble and considered us more important at the time. That's why he died for us. There was a missionary who was scheduled to speak at a large church, and yes, this is a real missionary. I'm just not going to mention his name, in Australia. The moderator of the service introduced the missionary in very eloquent and glowing terms. He told the congregation who was there to gather that all that the missionary had accomplished in China and various other places, and then presented him as our illustrious guest. Well, the missionary stood quietly for a moment and then opened his message by saying, "Dear friends, I am the little servant of an illustrious master." And you see, that's why we need humility, to put ourselves in proper relationship to our God and our Savior, in the task with which we're given, the calling to make known the manifold wisdom of God. And if we don't do it in humility, we will never get the manifold wisdom of God across to those around us. So I hope you'll take the time to think through who you are, what you can do, and how you can serve in humility our God and the congregation where God has placed you. Goodbye, and God bless.